Kia ora, ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to Citizen A, where we wrap the week's current affairs with the best political team on television from a very, very Auckland perspective. Warning, we're as fair and balanced as Fox News. Joining me tonight are my revolving panel of bloggers and Auckland opinion shapers. Here's the political columnist for the NBR, political consultant, commentator and moral shepherd of the right, Matthew Hooton. And she is from the Auckland University Department of Film, TV and Media Studies, one of the best bloggers in New Zealand, Phoebe Fletcher. Welcome to you both. Coming up tonight's issue 1, Key senses danger and backs down on classroom sizes. Keen political instincts or self-inflicted mutilation. Issue 2, rising retirement, economic sense or more baby boomer intergenerational theft. Issue 3, Tama Iti gets 2.5 years, Rena Captain gets 7 months. What have we learned from the Urewera terrorism trials? Plus, we'll end the show on a final word, but let's kick things off with tonight's first issue. One would have imagined taxing paper boys, the disabled, the sick and the elderly in long-term care for a pathetic saving of $90 million and a budget of $70 billion was a PR disaster too far. Following that up with larger classroom sizes seems intentionally self-mutilating. Is Key's intervention his political instincts kicking in, or proof his advisors are asleep at the wheel? Matthew, Vernon Small says the problem was that only Treasury and Inland Revenue were privy to the changes and they didn't appreciate the political ramifications. Who is overseeing political strategy for the government?
I don't know the answer to that question. I think on the intermediate school, or the school issue generally, what used to happen under both the previous National Government and in the previous Labor government is the Minister would get a statement from the Ministry, a spreadsheet, of the impact of the budget changes on every school in the country. Oh. So that, and this is a little bit cynical, so that the Minister or the local MP, if they were a government MP, could write to the school and say, good news, you're going to have an extra teacher, or your school library's going to get some more books or be repainted. And in this case, that didn't seem to happen. Perhaps this government feels that that's an invasion of schools' privacy or something to get that type of information. But it seems to me that clearly nobody thought about how these changes would impact on individual schools. And when you do staffing changes to schools, for most schools it's very minor, but there's always these ends of the bell curve. And you would have thought that the Minister would be able to say off the top of her head who the 16 worst affected schools are, so that even she, or at least senior MPs or officials, could have rung them and said, look, this is being announced, it is bad news, but this is how we're going to... So a very poor piece of political management.
Did the Education Minister get happy John or angry John that day?
I think that she would have seen a different John Key in the privacy of his office than what we see when he's visiting primary schools in his happy John Key mode.
Phoebe, Education Minister Hekia Parata was this morning heckled by teachers protesting against bigger class sizes when she arrived to give a post-budget speech in Wellington. Is she damaged goods now politically?
I don't know if she's damaged goods. I mean, I find this quite remarkable, this absolute botch up, because I think I've been sitting here for the last 6 months or so saying that Hekia Parata was actually quite a smart choice because she would be able to shepherd through the charter schools.
Everyone thought that.
You know, she seemed to be a well-performing MP. However, she didn't get heckled that much, it's worth noting. But I think this is an absolute botch up, as Matthew says. You know, that there is no way that this should have gone through without making those calculations first. It's an absolute back down, and you know, it's extraordinary that these sorts of things weren't calculated first.
Why do you think they weren't calculated first? Is it hubris creeping into the second term?
I think possibly. I think, you know, as we've been saying for a while, a lot of these sorts of changes are ideological, you know, in terms of the management, but also listening to Treasury in terms of class advice rather than listening to the teachers. And, you know, as a result, we're seeing continuing industrial action. So there is going to be a stop work meeting in the next month from teachers. So this has been poorly managed.
Has it damaged her ascent to the top?
I think possibly slightly. I mean, this is the worst thing that you could expect in the post-budget week, isn't it, really? This kind of absolute PR disaster.
Matthew, when John Key is having to claim schools losing 2 teachers as a victory, doesn't that suggest he's wandered into a political minefield? National standards are a theoretical issue, but fewer teachers in classrooms is a reality that parents can directly relate to. How does National turn this around?
Well, I think the difficulty that the government has is that John Key has ruled out so much of the overall, you mentioned $70 billion budget, a bit more than that. He's ruled out so much of that from being touched.
Yeah.
Obviously, superannuation is the number one. Basically, healthcare just continues to rise unchecked, and most of social policy, except some minor things, which actually in the scheme of the overall education system, these class sizes changes aren't enormous. But basically, he's ruled out making changes to most of the budget, and yet the fiscal situation that New Zealand faces is the worst it's been for many decades. Bill English will borrow $70 billion in the time that he's going to be finance minister, which is more than a year's entire budget just borrowed. And the government wants to try and reduce its borrowing, but because it won't cut working for families, it won't cut superannuation, it won't look at interest-free student loans, all those sorts of issues, it's left with, 30 million here, 10 million here, and this incredible thing. Paper boys and girls, a $14 million saving that will affect 60,000 of them.
Yeah.
Each of them are going to lose not very much, but for a paper boy or paper girl, it is quite a lot.
Sure.
And I would have thought a national government believes in kids learning to work early, and get jobs like that, and doesn't believe in taxing people and raising their taxes. Well, the first message that these young people getting a first part-time job is that the government is raising your taxes. I don't think that's a smart move.
Be honest. Do you honestly think that we are going to get $200 million surplus in 2014?
Oh, no.
But
no one thinks that. I mean, no. The fact is that is a target that, to keep the pressure on the bureaucracy and on ministers, I think it's useful for the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister to keep saying that's the goal. But no, I don't think anyone has any expectation that there'll be a surplus that year. The long-term fiscal position of New Zealand is disastrous. Without changes to superannuation and healthcare as a result of the ageing population. Unless changes are made to those policies by sort of 2030, New Zealand's debt will be greater than, as a percentage of GDP, than what you see in Italy.
Right.
And by 2040, it'll be much worse than Greece. So that issue, superannuation and the impact of the ageing population, has to get dealt with.
Why don't we have a government who is as popular as it is, making the hard calls? I mean, they've got political capital to burn.
Well, I think that what the government prefers is to go very gently and softly on most issues, especially these big ones that burnt National in the 1990s, and try to engineer political situations where the public is urging them to do something unpopular.
Right.
And the government reluctantly does that. I mean, this is exactly what happened with the tax cuts. In 2009, National was going to cut tax every year in its first term. And the first promise that National broke was it cancelled the 2010 and 2011 tax cuts that were promised before the election. That was a broken promise. And what they did was they got everyone caught, oh, Mr. English, it's fiscally irresponsible. You can't cut tax anymore. You've cut tax once, but you can't keep cutting it. And eventually the government said, all right, then we won't. And I think they're trying to engineer a situation where the public says you've got to deal with superannuation, and then the government reluctantly does so.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up the superannuation, even though I disagree with a lot of what else you said, Matthew. But this is one of the only times I've heard you sounding like David Parker, because this is what he's been saying over the last week. I bet he is horrified. Is that, not dealing with superannuation, this is why we're getting these cuts in education.
Right.
And, Matthew, I think, is right in that respect, that you have got a government that is floating itself on trying to, be populist in terms of superannuation and not deal with it. And they're getting a backlash here. I mean, there are 1 million parents with kids of school age. This is a major issue.
The majority of cabinet ministers won't be impacted by larger class sizes in public schools because they send their kids to private schools. Are these double standards a case of what's good for the goose isn't good for the cabinet minister?
Well, I think that some of the cabinet ministers, perhaps don't understand what it's like to be in a lower socio-economic school, because, as many principals have said, these are the people that are going to be most affected.
Right.
If it's the additional teacher that comes in to help with people with learning difficulties that ends up getting the chop, if it's, basically teachers not being able to place as much attention on the higher achievers as well as the lower achievers in class, and I can say this as a teacher myself, I understand exactly what is meant by that rise in class ratios, and I don't think you would find anyone in the education system that thinks it's a great thing.
Question both of you. Has the PPTA EdZEI finally been gifted a course they can really rally around with class sizes?
Oh, they'll be thrilled.
Thrilled?
The unions will be thrilled by this. They are enormously wealthy unions, enormously powerful. They are militantly left-wing, aligned to the Labour Party and the Green Party, and they've now got an issue to take the fight to the government on behalf of their political allies for ideological reasons, and they will do so, and they tend to win.
The Education Minister has handed the unions an amazing stick to beat her with, haven't they?
I think they have, but I would disagree with Matthew. I mean, like, teaching is not really a career that you get into if you want to earn a lot of money. Most teachers are there for the benefit of their students, and they are genuinely interested in learning.
Oh, and I was talking about the union bosses in Wellington, that, yeah, rather than the
I
chalk
think,
face.
you know, this is the problem, is that we're listening to Treasury rather than people that are in the education system.
Thank you, panel. Moving on with issue 2, raising the retirement age has become the topic du jour as opposition parties point out that $800 million savings could be made by lifting it to 66. Is this economic sense or more baby boomer intergenerational theft? Matthew, Gen Xers and Gen Y have had to pay for their own education, pay for their own KiwiSaver retirement, have to try and save for a first home in a property market speculated beyond their means by greedy baby boomers, and now have to contemplate a higher retirement age on top of all that. Is this a principled stand by the government against intergenerational theft?
Well, everyone knows that it has to rise. I mean, it's rising all around the world. Life expectancy is rising, so it makes sense it will rise. And I think every baby boomer, if they're honest and not just continuing the pattern that they've done through most of their lives of trying to exploit indulgences from other taxpayers, they themselves will know it has to rise at some point. But their political interest as a baby, the baby boomers, what they want to do is delay it as long as possible so that they're over the hump. Now, it has to happen very soon. As I think I said earlier, that by 2020, the cost of superannuation will exceed the total amount spent on education across New Zealand. By 2030, the amount spent on superannuation will exceed the amount spent on health care of people of all ages. And by 2040, we would have public debt around about that or above that of Greece has today, and the economy would collapse under the weight of that debt. So it has to get sorted out, I think and hope, and perhaps I'm hoping against hope, that John Key does intend to get this debate happening subtly, arrange for himself to be pressured, and then go into the next election with a more sensible promise than his promise that there will be no change to this by either $1 or a single day. There has to be change to superannuation, and fairly quickly.
Could you believe that his justification for not lifting the age was that he didn't want to give Winston Peters a platform to go around the country? That's not political leadership.
Well, it's legitimate in one sense, but I guess the reason he has to move on this is because Winston Peters, he can only get a third term, it looks like, as Prime Minister with the support of Winston Peters.
Right.
Which suggests that, and that's the same with Labour. So it looks like Winston Peters will be in the next government. Seems to me now is the time for leadership on this issue, and I just hope he gets round to leadership a bit earlier than 2014.
Phoebe, isn't raising the retirement age racist and anti-worker? Māori male life expectancy is only 70 years, while people living in poverty live for only 73 years.
Okay, I think there is a few issues around this. I mean, first of all, I would agree with Matthew that I think it needs to be raised. If you look at our population statistics, by 2050, half of our population is going to be over the age of 40. Now that means that we've got the same problem as a lot of Western countries around the world, where we've got a highly ageing population and not really the amount of people that are working beneath that to be able to support that in tax. So I do support raising the retirement age. I do not think that John Key is engineering some kind of pressure cooker to be. What we have seen actually is that a huge attack on welfare spending, but this has been ignoring the fact that a lot of the welfare is actually on superannuation. And yes, I do think that there are issues around life expectancy, and David Shearer's announcement that he would be looking at, perhaps potentially lowering that age for people that were in kind of harder jobs or so on, was something that the Mana Party and Māori Party were kind of discussing before the election. And I think what we're seeing here is that we've got unpopular policy on Labour's part before the election, because let's face it, the older that you are, the more likely you are to vote.
Yes.
So these are kind of key constituencies for them. And I think what we're seeing is Shearer attempting to kind of reposition himself to give a little bit of sugar to that kind of hard pill.
Is it okay to say something nice about Peter Dunn?
You can. Well, we don't like to, but
Well, I
go on.
generally don't like to either. He is from Wellington, and centrist politics has never appealed to me. But anyway, he has put a chink in John Key's armour on this. In the United Future Confidence and Supply Agreement with the government, he demanded, and National conceded to him, that there will be some discussion document and consultation process on something called flexible superannuation, which is what you're talking about. You can either take it at 60 and get a lower rate. So if you're worked in manual labour on the minimum wage, at 60 you can retire and basically continue to get some, a reasonably a lower amount, or you can wait till you're 65 or 70 and then you get more. So you get to choose when to retire, and that has an implication on how much money you get per week. That hopefully will lead to a wider discussion. The other thing that the Treasury's done, and this is, I'm assuming the Beehive must have approved this, but maybe the Treasury's being sneaky. They've appointed Bob Buckle from Victoria University to lead a process to check the Treasury's forecasts for long-run fiscal policy that does show, as I was saying earlier, that we'll end up worse than Greece by 2040 unless we deal with superannuation. And the Treasury and Victoria University are going to host a big conference in December, with the New Zealand government coat of arms attached to it, to discuss New Zealand's long-term fiscal position. And John Key must know about this. I think he must have approved it, and he must know that his promise of no change ever is necessarily going to be lampooned at that conference. And so maybe there are starting to be little things.
Well, there is quite a lot of agreement on the opposition parties over superannuation.
And in everyone in the National Party, including probably even the Prime Minister, knows the promise is ridiculous.
But
so we've got a consensus here.
When you look at his language, though, when you look at his demeanour when he's asked about it, it's almost... There almost seems to be a spoilt brat element of, I've made my word, I'm sticking to it, regardless of what the rest of you say.
Well, as I say, he made solemn promises that there would be 3 rounds of tax cuts. It was at North Harbour Stadium. He announced his tax policy as Leader of the Opposition in 2008. He said there were 3 rounds of tax cuts. He did 1 round of tax cuts. He broke his promise with respect to the 2nd and 3rd set of tax cuts. He has broken promises before. This one is a promise he also needs to break.
But he's put his job on the line. I will resign if I do.
Well, he needs to find a way to talk that back.
How does he do it? How does he do it? What would your advice to him be to actually do him?
He needs to wait till there's a crescendo of public pressure on this issue, and then reluctantly break his promise, but say that the country has asked me to remain as Prime Minister. Does
he look weak though if he waits for the crescendo? Because it's not showing leadership, is it?
But they don't believe in. That's very similar to Michael Cullen and Helen Clark. They don't believe in showing leadership. They believe in being transactional, responding to events in society rather than leading.
Phoebe, is the issue in New Zealand that baby boomers are simply too large a voting bloc to annoy, and like a vampire generation, they will suck us dry?
I think the issue is around voting blocks, and that's one of the reasons why it became a key issue in the election that Key said he would not touch. Because if you do look at the work that has been done by Statistics New Zealand on voters, you are more likely to vote the older that you get. So that is a kind of key constituency that you target and that you try not to harass. You know, it's easier to harass, I guess, solo mothers or beneficiaries than it is to target something like superannuation.
Thank you both. Moving on to issue 3 tonight. Tama Iti gets 2.5 years. Rena Captain gets 7 months. What have we learned from the Urewera terrorism trial? Matthew, isn't crashing a ship and spilling 400,000 litres of pollution a far bigger threat to New Zealand than a Coke bottle Molotov cocktail? Does anyone...
Well, it wasn't a Coke bottle Molotov cocktail. It was firearms offences. I think the issue...
There was a Coke bottle
filled
with petrol.
I think
the
issue
Molotov.
is, and there were firearms involved.
Yeah.
I think that
There were what, 3?
I don't think you can compare the two cases in the sense that there was no intent with the Rena. There was gross negligence, and I'm pleased the guy's going to jail.
Yeah.
Whereas in the other one, there is intent, and there were according to the evidence that has been put in the public domain, there was talk, at least, of assassination of major political figures. So that was taken into
account. A bus at George Bush's head. A bus at George Bush's
head.
No,
there was talk of it that was quite funny.
The
really.
police commissioner said that there was no specific target.
There was published in the Dominion. There were threats that it was quite amusing because they said we want to kill the Prime Minister, and one of the other people said, "Oh, you mean Helen Clark?" They said, "No, the new one, the one that's going to be Prime Minister next year," which is so. You know,
but you and I both know from our times out on the Terps together. People will say things, talk about this, talk about that. Talk's cheap, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, surely... I didn't sit. I wasn't part of the jury. I wasn't the judge.
Yeah.
But there was more than talk, and there was not piss talk at the pub.
Yep.
There was some type of activity going on, and there were some recordings of conversations that the authorities, and including the judge, were concerned about. And I guess Tamidi, he goes to jail, he'll be out, by mid next year.
Phoebe, this case has cost $14 million when you include the surveillance budgets of the security agencies. It allowed illegal spying tactics by the police and demonised a community who have a long, righteous history of grievance with the government. Do the police owe New Zealand an apology?
I think they do, and I think, even Heather Roy from ACT was, in agreement.
Which was
on
surprising,
this,
wasn't it?
Q&A the other day. And some of the facts that Matthew said there, I read through, I don't know whether this is very naughty, but, when the transcripts were actually leaked online, I was one of those people that, had to have a look.
Yes.
And, it seems overplayed to me, and the fact that most of the firearms were registered, the fact that it was petrol in a Coke bottle, it seems to me like the police have overreacted. Greg O'Connor of the Police Association got reduced to doing a kind of Winston Peters, no holding up a picture, would you trust these people on Native Affairs the other night. It seems to me that there is actually a lack of credibility here, and that there is a kind of tendency from the state, in the same way that with something like Ahmazawi, where, they come hard down on in a kind of punitive way when they've actually been shown up to, have trumped up charges.
You think this was face-saving? This was face-saving?
Yes, I think it is. These were all charges that should have never have come under the Terrorism Suppression Act. They could have been prosecuted under the Crimes Act in terms of holding firearms, which, as we know, Tūhoe has kind of a long history of colonial resistance, and people don't in the past have not even necessarily registered their births, so not registering a couple of firearms, even though most of them were registered out of them.
That's right.
These sentences are disproportionate. The fact that they let Tama Iti out of the country to go and perform in London, tells me that he's not that much of a threat.
Matthew, let's be honest though. If this had been Kyle Chapman up in the mountains doing some sort of quasi-military thing with him and his little National Front mates, we wouldn't be sitting here saying 2.5 years is too long. We'd be sitting here saying it's not long enough, wouldn't we?
You're talking about another nutcase, so I don't want to start making comparisons. I think the issue is the court system in one sense has worked. The courts, and Russell Fairbrother, who was a hopeless MP, has turned out to be a good lawyer. He's got his client off initially on the terrorism. Well, they were dropped, and then there were the other charges, and in the end, the court system has worked, and what they were convicted on were, moderately serious firearms charges rather than the bigger things. So the courts seem to have worked through these things adequately, and our system works. And whatever people think about the overall issue, there can be some comfort in that. I think, and there's no doubt, that the police operation was overkill and a fiasco. And I, at the time, was deeply suspicious of it. I want to know the involvement of the Beehive. I think there does need to be an inquiry into specifically what Helen Clark knew about this.
How could she not have known as the head
of
of the SIS?
Well, she's head of the SIS.
How could she not have known?
She was briefed on it. She apparently said they should use the Maori language to conduct the arrests, so she was involved in operational details. And the other thing that was always very suspicious is, how come TVNZ and TV3 knew it was going to happen? So someone tipped them off. I don't know if that was the police, but I'd like to know how this all happened. It has been a major issue for New Zealand, and the Prime Minister John Key should have an inquiry into
Credible that Annette King was only told a very different story the night before the raids
Well,
happened?
police ministers are in one of those strange positions that they're constitutionally not allowed to be involved in their departments. But that's not true of the SIS minister.
Right.
The SIS minister does have some involvement, and Anyway, I could be being totally unfair to Helen Clark here, but it just seems suspicious right from day one.
That she said she didn't know it.
And I think that you're always best to clear the air.
Phoebe, the police have gained vast new surveillance powers out of this, allowing them to break into our homes and plant spy cameras. Is the legacy of the Urewera terror raids that we've all lost some civil rights here?
I think we all have. I mean, the search and surveillance bill was an absolute travesty for civil rights, and that they allowed legislation to go through that was retrospective is also incredibly problematic. You know, I believe the Law Society had quite a lot of problems with that.
Yeah.
I mean, this whole case has been something where you have had quite a lot of kind of cross-political agreements that this was handled badly, that this seems to be overkill, and that legally a lot of the things around it seem to be very, very tenuous.
Yeah. Final question, you're both on this. Tame Iti, will he win his appeal?
No idea, but his lawyers got him off most of the charges so far, so you'd have to say he's going to be well represented.
He'll win the appeal. It was a phenomenal sentence handed out.
Oh, I'm not sure.
Okay. Let's wrap the show with last word. Matthew, your last word this week is?
I think we're seeing the end of Shane Jones's career one way or the other. He's now been stood down pending the Auditor General's investigation into this Bill Liu affair. The thing is, the Auditor General says it could take up to a year for her report to be done. So what, we're into 2013. If it leaves unanswered questions, then you might have a police investigation. You know, even if in the end of all this, Shane Jones is completely cleared and it turns out that his story of granting Mr. Liu citizenship to stop his organs from being harvested by the communist regime in China, even if that story turns out to be true.
Difficult as it is to believe.
Yeah, even if it all turns out to be true, I think his political career is over. He is looking for a job, and I think he'd be better. It's in his interests and that of his family to leave Parliament now, and so that Carol Beaumont can come into Parliament and have a good run through the next election.
Would Carol Beaumont change the math internally for Labour in terms of the ABC camp and supporters
you mean for
of
the
Shearer?
leadership challenge in November?
Yes.
I still think Shearer will have the numbers in November when Cunliffe makes his challenge.
Phoebe, your final word this week is?
My final word would have to be on Judy McGregor's report into the rest homes.
Yes.
And I think this is an incredibly important issue. We do need to make sure our elderly are being well looked after, and the stress that is being placed on those people that are working in rest homes, you know, they're dealing with things that most of us would find very hard to deal with, is something that really needs to be addressed. I do think that there needs to be a pay rise there. $13 an hour is not a lot for doing that kind of work.
Yeah. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Phoebe. Ladies and gentlemen, to my final word, I'm hosting the Christchurch, Palmerston North, Dunedin and Hamilton Save TVNZ 7 meetings. Former Broadcasting Minister Jonathan Coleman was caught out this week lying about TVNZ 7's audience numbers to justify cutting it off, while it has been revealed that TVNZ didn't spend any money or effort promoting TVNZ 7 because they feared it would detract from their own ratings. Wallace Chapman ended up having to pay for advertising to promote backbenchers out of his own pocket. The manner in which this government have gutted public broadcasting to end Stratos, TVNZ 7 and regional TV should be seen for what it is: cultural vandalism. The dumber and less informed the sleepy hobbits in New Zealand are, the happier the 1%. If you like tonight's show, please join our Citizen A Facebook site and connect with other like-minded new citizens, and follow me on my Citizen Bomber Twitter and Facebook page. Don't forget, my new show, The Union Report, plays 8 p.m. Monday nights here on Triangle TV, the home of original public broadcasting. Thanks for watching, whānau. Good night, Aotearoa.
Supporting local content so you can see more of New Zealand on air.